Good morning or afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the International Biochar Initiative webinar, a regional model for forest biomass management, carbon drawdown, drought resiliency, and nitrogen conservation. My name is Caroline Pete, and I will be facilitating this webinar. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. You should already be able to hear me and see the share screen. If you're hearing echoes or your sound quality is bad, use the audio functions in the GoToWebinar toolbar, which is probably on the right side of your screen. If you still have any trouble, send the organizers a message using the chat feature. And don't worry, we are also recording this webinar. The recording and slides will be available soon after the live event. If you have a question, you may ask it at any time using the questions pod on the GoToWebinar panel. We will handle all questions after the last presentation in a group discussion with our panelists. So I want to thank you all again for joining us, and I'm going to hand it off to our moderator, Kathleen Draper, to lead you through the great presentations we have for you today. Kathleen, please take it away.
Thanks, Caroline, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I think we have a record in terms of how long our title is today for the webinar, but I think it's a really interesting topic on biomass to biochar, and I hope it will inspire others around the world to think about how they can improve and use underutilized or unsafe biomass to become more resilient to the impacts we're facing with climate change, and as well as to start drawing down carbon. But first, for those that are new to the International Biochar Initiative, allow me a moment or two to get you acquainted with who we are. IBI is a nonprofit focused on fostering robust, sustainable biochar across the globe. And one of our primary goals is to connect those new and old in the biochar ecosystem. And that includes researchers, biochar entrepreneurs, policymakers, potential customers, and more recently, I'm happy to say, investors, which is a very welcome addition to the biochar industry. We see content curation and dissemination as one of the key ways we can help support the growth of the biochar industry. And we do that through monthly newsletters and bibliographies of peer-reviewed research, by publishing white papers, and through webinars and biochar study tours, as well as other activities. We are always on the lookout for talented and passionate volunteers to help us get the message out to different interest groups. So if you'd like to engage more actively with the biochar community, please reach out to us. Next slide. The growth of the biochar industry has really been heating up over the past year or two. The motivators, mechanisms, and models encouraging that growth differ by country or region in many ways. In some parts of the world, the motivators seem like they have less to do with climate change, and they're more about reducing air pollution or landfill diversion of organic material. Today, we'll be talking about a model developed to address multiple issues facing California through economic development, increasing fire risk, the need to improve water and nutrient management, and of course, climate change. And while this model has not yet been adopted, it's spurring a lot of conversations within, and hopefully after this webinar, beyond the state of California. And those of you that have listened in on previous webinars know that whenever possible, I try to combine an academic perspective with a commercial perspective. So today, kicking off our talk will be the academic view, and that is going to be provided by Daniel Sanchez from the University of California at Berkeley. So without further ado, Daniel, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Great. Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm really looking forward to telling you a bit about the forestry situation that we face in California, and I think the unique role that that innovative wood products, things like biochar, can play in really driving far better outcomes for our economy, for our ecosystems, and certainly for our communities that live around and near the forests. So what I'll do today is I will walk you through a little bit of background information around California forestry and the kind of the overwhelming management issues that we are facing and then talk a little bit about the role that, again, innovative wood products, particularly things like biochar, can play in ensuring that forest management is not only an economic win, not only a fire reduction and safety win, but also a win for the climate. All of these, I think, this vision is, as Kathleen mentioned, is something that the state of California is keenly interested in. I'll be showing up some of my original research here, but suffice it to say that I am part of a lot of conversations with a number of stakeholders, including folks like Josiah from Pacific Biochar, around really how we can build a new industry here, one that works much better for all aspects of the state of California. Let's do next slide. So just to catch everyone up, I want to spend a second talking about the forests of California. California is a tremendously diverse state, probably 600 miles long, with over 30 million acres of forest land. And again, we have deserts, trees, mountains. We have a tremendously large agriculture. We can think of California as, again, a country in and of itself, one of the largest if it were a country by itself. And so with all of that space and all of that heterogeneity, of course, comes very heterogeneous forests. I imagine the most iconic tree and the one that people think about when they're in the state of California are redwood trees. We do indeed have them. They're they're beautiful and they're abundant, but they're actually limited primarily to the California coastline, as shown in the red dots here. The rest of California consists of a number of other conifer species, the most prominent being Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. And we also have a number of kind of coexisting conifer species all throughout the Sierras, throughout the Sierra Nevada range, where we have a lot of our forests. Those are generally classified as mixed conifer forests. But I want to be clear. We are talking about primarily here. We're talking about the management on the 15 million acres, about the half of the acres in the state of California that are classified as timberland. Those grow merchantable species that can be harvested to take to a sawmill or to make other wood products. And they are primarily softwood species, and they are primarily conifers. Next slide. We also have a moderately sized forest products industry in the state of California. Again, kind of on the edges of our forest ecosystems in a lot of places, including throughout kind of the Sierra foothills and the Central Valley of California, and also kind of concentrated up in the northern half of the state. Our two primary largest sources of utilization of biomass are for saw logs. That's shown in the green dots, the green round dots on this map. These are sawmills. And then the other largest part of wood utilization in the state of California is actually biomass power plants. These are, generally fairly conventional biomass power plants on the range of maybe 10 to 25 megawatts of generating capacity. And they are littered and scattered throughout the state of California. I think the most important distinction between our sawmills and between our biomass mills is that sawmills really, they make money. They operate, they work with large trees. These are trees that command a large commercial value, and therefore drive a lot of forest management within the state of California. Biomass is in many ways and in many places a break-even industry at best, where we are dealing with a lot of other competition from low carbon renewables or cheaper, lower cost solar, lower cost wind, and of course lower cost fossil energy plants. Biomass is the industry has gone up and down. It has managed to keep a foothold, but it is not the overwhelming driver of forest management. Again, that is at least on private land, that is the demand for commercial saw logs. Next slide. But on top of the heterogeneity of the forests that we have in California, what I think is really important is the tremendous diversity of ownership across the state. These are this is a quite small map actually made by the Collins Pine Company that I'm sharing here, and we see not only in the top left corner National Park Service land, but also United States Forest Service land. Those are managed, of course, by different federal agencies. The National Park Service is part of the U.S. Department of the Interior, whereas the Forest Service is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We also, however, have a mixture of private owners as well, including commercial timber companies, in this case, the Collins Pine Company, but also small private landowners. We have and again, these groups all have really different mandates for how they're directed to manage forests. They operate under different regulatory regimes, you know, they face tremendously different incentives. We have large commercial timber landowners that are really primarily focused on managing their land to maximize productivity and to make profits from the large trees that they grow. We have small private landowners that face some commercial pressures, but also are very interested in conservation and on forest management and forest resilience. And then we have the U.S. Forest Service, which has a multiple use mandate and interest in promoting timber production, recreation, conservation, biodiversity, water availability, really everything we think of forests and everything we rely on forests for. It is the job of the U.S. Forest Service to promote all of them at the same time. And this multiple use mandate manifests itself in very different ways. But suffice it to say that I think management on U.S. Forest Service land looks very different than management on commercial lands, particularly ones commercial timberland owned by commercial timber companies. That being said, I do think we have a tremendously shared amount of risks. These are interconnected ecosystems. The ownership is patchy, the forests are not. And the management on one plot, on 1 acre, on one ecosystem has tremendous implications for the other forests around it as well, particularly in the context of forest mortality, which I'll say a bit more about in a second. Next slide. I want to note that we have historically had a fairly large forest products industry in the state of California. Much of it concentrated in the Redwood region, but really spanning the entire northern half of the state. We have seen a long and protracted decline in timber harvests, particularly on national forests, due primarily to environmental lawsuits, but a whole host of other management issues as well, including lack of funding, budgets being diverted for fire, for putting out fires rather than preventing fires. But we have historically had a much larger forest products industry in the state of California than we do have right now. The decline has been not only on the national forest land, but also on private land as well. And as I mentioned before, I think a lot of the biomass that we harvest in the state of California is primarily intended for lumber and other products that can be made from merchantable saw logs. But again, a lot of use of residues for biomass energy, other kind of low-value products, things like landscaping, mulch, or animal bedding, and a really diverse set of products that are being made from forest biomass in the state of California. Next slide. And we have, again, we've had a kind of long-term decline in the overall level of management in California forests, but it's important to note that we do have a robust forest product sector, including not only kind of primary forestry and logging, where we employ somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000 workers in the state of California, but also a tremendous number of primary and secondary wood processing facilities and employment that result from that. Those are things like wood furniture, pulp and paper, solid and other kind of solid wood products. We have a relatively low number of employment despite the amount of biomass going into the use for woody biomass. And that is because these are low margin and highly mechanized plants whose job it is to make electricity for a low cost. Next slide. But as I'm sure most of you are aware, given the fire season of 2017 and 2018, not to mention, of course, the public safety power shutoffs that we are experiencing and under kind of continual threat of around Northern California, we have a problem with fire and particularly large scale and severe fire in the state of California. This is the result of, I think, decades of mismanagement of California forests. I noted that there has been a decline in the forest products and the forest products industry in the state of California. What that has led to, alongside active fire suppression policies by both the state and federal regulators, CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service. What this has really led to is an accumulation of fuels within our forest ecosystems. This accumulation of fuels has made for a tremendous fire risk in the state of California. Our forests are in a Mediterranean climate. They are historically kind of pre-European settlements, had relatively short fire return intervals, and this notion of low severity fire that returns fairly regularly to our forest ecosystems really served a number of different and important ecological functions. With the active forest suppression and the decline of forest management, we have really entered a situation, though, where California, as our governor has proclaimed, needs sustained focus and immediate action to protect their communities from wildfire. And the state is tremendously focused on how we can reduce wildfire risk, do it in a way that doesn't bankrupt the state, hopefully can be profitable and contribute to regional economic development, and also maintains and ensures that California forests are a resilient carbon sink. And it is hard to do all three of those things at the same time. It's relatively easy to do two of them, to have forest carbon and not make money, to make money and reduce fire. But it's very hard to get all three to work at the same time. And this is really the role of innovative wood products that I had been mentioning, that I mentioned at the beginning of this call. Next slide. We can think of a number of different ways that we can manage California forests. One idea would be to continue to let them grow. This is similar to the undermanagement that we're facing right now. And we have a lot of forest carbon, of course. We have lots of trees, lots of accumulations of fuels in the forest, but also very high fire mortality, and we've been seeing that increasing over time. Next slide. Another option would be to continue business as usual. This is something that I think makes sense for fire risk reduction and for forest economics. Essentially, it involves harvesting the large trees for transport to sawmills to make money, to make saw logs and dimensional lumber. But a lot of low-value biomass and forest residues, these are the tops and the branches of trees. These are small diameter trees. These are otherwise non-merchantable trees They are typically piled and burned or just left on the forest floor. This is a waste of a resource in many ways, and it's because we don't have a commercial driver to pull that biomass out of the forest. The merchantable trees, of course, produce houses, furniture, and paper, but we are leaving a lot of biomass in the forest in California. This is not the best way to manage for carbon, particularly because these trees typically decompose relatively quickly once they are harvested. And if we're not putting them into things like houses or furniture, they are simply putting that carbon back into the atmosphere. Next slide. So what we're really interested in is, can we identify these innovative wood uses that not only lead to good carbon outcomes, but also lead to good economic outcomes. These innovative wood products, including things like biochar, can hopefully, our hypothesis is that they can drive not only profitable forest management, carbon beneficial forest management that reduces fire risks within the state of California. And so what I spend a lot of my time doing right now is thinking about these kinds of new wood products that can attract higher prices, how they fit into California's regulatory and policy environment, then understanding what impact those wood products would have on forest management and fire risk reduction across the state if these industries were to be built and scaled up, and then ultimately understanding the carbon and the employment impacts of this expanded management and these new markets. And this is really a vision that kind of satisfies all three parts of that vision I had put before, where we are reducing fire risk, we are managing the forest profitably, and we are getting very good carbon outcomes that align with the state of California's stringent climate policies. Next slide. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about not only the uses of merchantable timber to get good carbon sequestration outcomes and to make more money. A lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about new innovative structural wood products, mass timber, for example. There's this prospect of building 18-story buildings out of large laminated wood panels to displace steel and concrete, and that is a really good thing for the climate and a new and exciting market the state of California is thinking about. But we're also really focused on these forest residues and this waste forest biomass that is otherwise piled and burned or left to decay within the forest. And it's really there that we see biofuels and biochar, and actually the two products really working together as providing a really an exciting new innovative wood product for the state of California that can really fit this vision. Next slide. And again, when we do forest management, we produce both lumber and waste wood. What we are tremendously interested in doing is developing new processes, in this case, pyrolysis units that take waste wood and make not only biochar, but also bio-oil that can be separated, fractionated, upgraded, and essentially made into a gasoline or diesel blend stock. These are systems that not only displace gasoline and diesel, these are systems that not only provide use for waste biomass that is otherwise going into the atmosphere, but they also promote long-lived carbon sequestration through the co-production of biochar alongside biofuels. And we think this is one of many innovative wood products that we think can really help drive beneficial forest management in the state. Next slide. And so I want to take you quickly through some results of some modeling that I have done working with economic decision-making tools for the state of California, again, thinking about how we can manage our 33 million acres of land and do it in a way that is profitable. We find that if we have these new markets for biochar and for biofuels that collect subsidies under the state's low carbon fuel standard, a very lucrative policy to produce low carbon fuels, we can treat about 1 million acres a year of forests to not only produce these products, but also to lead to far lower fire risks. And so we're finding that implementing this kind of profitable treatment with these new products, including biochar and biofuels, could lead to, again, the 1 million acres of profitable forest management per year, but also a 41% reduction in fire mortality, including 3 million acres, so again, 1/10 of our forest in the state, of stand replacing fire. These are the severe wildfires that you're hearing about when you watch the news, that are the tremendous risk to our forest ecosystems and to our forested communities in the state. Next slide. We find that because we are displacing steel and cement with mass timber, and we are displacing petroleum, gasoline, diesel with biofuels, alongside carbon sequestration for long-lived carbon sequestration in biochar, we find that this forest management scenario actually leads to far better carbon outcomes than scenarios where we are just growing our forests or scenarios where we are not taking advantage of non-merchantable biomass. And this is on the order of 10 to 20 million tons of negative emissions compared to a baseline per year, which can make a sizable contribution to California's ambitions to not only dramatically reduce its emissions, but also to be a net zero carbon economy by the mid-century. Next slide. We've also done some work translating these forest management scenarios to try to understand the forestry and logging jobs that can be that accompany this 1 million acres a year of management. And I've worked with some economists at UC Berkeley to try to understand how that would impact the roughly 5,000 to 6,000 jobs we currently have in forestry and logging. We find that we can really nearly triple current direct forestry and logging jobs across the state through implementation of this scenario of management and innovative wood use through biofuels and biochar. And we think that's a really important result for the state, a state that is, of course, interested in regional economic development, and a state that has relatively high unemployment in its rural and forested communities compared to the economic powerhouses that we see on our coastal cities. Next slide. And again, we also see a surge in production from building these kind of fast pyrolysis biorefineries. We're talking about we're talking about a large burst of several or tens of thousands of construction jobs that come from that would come from building this wood processing and these new and innovative biofuel plants that of course would provide a short-term employment boost to the state. Next slide. And then, of course, this is really important, as I mentioned before, for rural California. These forested communities typically have higher unemployment rates than our major cities and our major population centers. And we find that the expanded forestry operations occur in counties with unemployment rates higher than the state average. Next slide. And I want to say that the state has really made a real effort to set these kinds of aspirational goals. I have an animation on this slide, if you don't mind cueing that. One where we understand the decades of fire exclusion, the drought, the stressors associated with climate change, and the overwhelming risks of tree mortality that we have in the state of California. And what we are, the state has really kind of set, again, these aspirational goals of about 1 million acres per year of management in order to reduce this fire risk, but also to ensure resilient carbon sinks and carbon stored in wood products throughout the state of California. And Josiah and I are involved in a number of different conversations about how we can make that happen. And I think that things like biofuels and biochar are a really key way that we are going to be able to align all of these objectives and to lead to much better outcomes for forest ecosystems in the state of California. I believe that is the end of my slides. I look forward to any questions we have during the Q&A period. At this point, I will turn over the presentation to Josiah Hunt to speak about some of the work that he's been doing.
Actually, Josiah, before you go, let me just interject here to introduce you. But I also want to give a shout out to the U.S. Forest Service in general. They are already, for the past few years, a big supporter of biochar and the U.S. biochar initiative. And I'm actually going out to their lab in Madison, Wisconsin next week to talk about, marketing biochar within the U.S. Forest Service more broadly. But moving on to our next presenter, many of you may already know Josiah. He is a fellow USBI board member and has been in the biochar industry for quite some time. And he's also something of a movie star recently. He was in the documentary Dirt Rich. But on a more day-to-day basis, he is the CEO of Pacific Biochar, where he paddles between Hawaii and California, building the market for biochar with vineyards and composters, state officials, carbon policy wonks, and more. So I'll let him tell you a little bit more about what he and his team have been up to. Josiah?
Hello, and thank you for that intro, Kathleen. All right, well, next slide. Okay. Oh, sorry, go back one. All right, so just just to reiterate what we're talking about here, the big California biochar model. We tried many other names. It was hard to sink it down into anything. It captured it better. That's what we're talking about here, and that's what I'm going to be explaining in the next series of slides here. Is basically a model that we built that. Well, it's the big California biochar model. Regional model for biomass management, carbon drawdown, drought resiliency, and nitrogen conservation. This was put together by myself and also Charlie McIntosh. Charlie is an employee with Pacific Biochar for the past year and has proven to be indispensable and quite adept at doing stuff like this, like the model that you're going to read about here. So next slide. A little bit about myself. One, as we go through this, you'll see that it looks like as though I've just discovered how to make collages on PowerPoint. And here is the first one. I just wanted to kind of show, I've been doing this a while, so I'm going to be talking about a lot of stuff. And I don't have a doctorate, but I have a lot of real world experience. So since 2008, I've been producing biochar in many, many different ways all over the world, by hand, in pits, with machines of various sizes and shapes, and in different ecoregions. Next slide. In order to help make this work, I've found that the whole biochar idea, nothing's going to happen if nobody wants it. So all of the carbon sequestration and all of the waste management, energy production, all of this wonderful stuff, it's not going to happen if nobody wants it. And by and large, it's those who manage land that are going to decide the success of this. And by and large, that's mostly farmers. And so I have had a focus of trying to make biochar work for them. And that's involved quite a lot of post-pyrolysis processing. Here is various pictures spanning from 2008 to present of some various post-pyrolysis processes, largely involving compost type systems. Next slide. In that time, there's been quite a lot of experience gained with the applications of biochar, again, in a very wide spectrum of ecoregions, but primarily that's been Hawaii and California. Quite a bit also of stuff elsewhere, but large amount in Hawaii and California, which kind of covers a good amount of area. And so about 10 years plus of field work and some very interesting field trials. I'll be showing some of those field trial results later. Next slide. All right, so the big California biochar model. This started as a worksheet. You can see a little image of that worksheet below. It's actually a 4-page worksheet, and mostly it's the first page that we're going to be talking about here, the master sheet. That was the first that we developed, and it started out very different than what you'll see today. And then we also developed a narrative to provide instructions and also context on how to use the worksheet and what does it mean. Put it in context. And all references are cited. So we have a lot of input values, and we did the spreadsheet in a dynamic way, and we've shared it in its editable form. And so all of the inputs are referenced, and where they're not referenced, it's noted as an assumption. And those assumptions are based on our years of experience. And it is editable. So if you would like to take control of this, if you'd like to look at the model and modify it for your own purposes, you can change those input values to fit the difference that you're trying to find. And I very much welcome that. We'll talk more about that later. Again, here it's open to use and edit, and we would greatly appreciate your assistance in making this better. Next slide, please. So this model started with a question that came at us in various forms and just seemed to be the hot topic of the issue. No pun intended, but it fits. Catastrophic wildfires in California, and as Dan had so wonderfully explained, there's a forestry management problem we face in California, and there's a catastrophic wildfire concern, and not just concern, but reality that we need to deal with. And so we've been asked by various forest management groups, and I'm paraphrasing this, hey, biochar guys, we have this overload of forest biomass to deal with. Can you handle it? All of it? And it was that last part of the question that really, I'd been asked this more than once, and I was just really scratching my head like, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. So we began to map that out. And some of the first questions I had in my mind that I wanted to answer was, well, how much is all of it? What are they really talking about? I mean, we're not talking about the entire forest biomass. We're only talking about a certain section of it, the residues, the excess. What is that? How much is that? And if we were to take that and transform it into biochar, how much biochar would that be? And do we have enough acres of agricultural land to accept all of that? And biochar can be used for other things, but just simply looking at that one avenue, do we have enough agricultural land to accept that? So that was the beginning of this whole thing. Next slide. And that's how it grew. So first we identified some input values, such as what I just mentioned. And then we applied some formulas to calculate our chosen output values. We referenced everything as we went along. And where references were not robust or available, we noted our assumptions. And then finally, we developed a one-page cover sheet to explain the worksheet. Now, of course, this didn't work. And instead, we ended up with about a 17-page narrative. During that process, we began to add context, and we discovered that it was indispensable. And so a one-page cover sheet just wasn't quite sufficient. So this sent us back to the beginning again, and we began to flesh the whole thing out by adding context and to make a much more useful and relevant model. Next slide, please. So here's the master sheet. Here's the main page. We try to keep it succinct here. And this is probably like version 10 or something like that. As far as, again, we started with this for internal use only, and then we modified it for broad use. So on the right-hand side, you see there's the inputs. So all of the blue highlighted cells, those are all input values. And so if you want to go use this model and go play with it, those are the input values that you can change without breaking a formula or anything. So those are all the input values. And then everything that is not highlighted blue, that's an output value. So that's the result of a formula. That's the result of various input values. And then again, you can kind of see it's pretty small print in this. You'll see it more later. But every input cell is referenced. And then there's an entire reference page in the spreadsheet where all of the references are cited. And you can go check that out and change that as desired. Next slide, please. All right, again, so here's a closer look at the references and the input values. Some of the important things that I'm going to be talking about a lot here are these top two input values, which I've made bold: biomass utilization factor and biomass conversion efficiency. So first, I'm going to give a brief overview on biomass and what we're talking about here. In the forest biomass, you have the entire biomass of the forest. That's not what we're talking about. We're only talking about what is considered to be the excess, or what is considered to be the issue of management. You know, what portion of that do we need to manage? That's the thinnings, the logging residues, fire hazard management. There's various categories. And if you look to our narrative, or if you look to the reference section, you'll find exactly what we're talking about in greater detail. So there's two categories of that as well. There's the gross, what's called the gross forest biomass, which is the total amount of, and again, not the total biomass, but if we look at all the acres, what's the excess? And then we have the technical forest biomasses, which is only considering the acres of land that are reasonably accessible, either currently reasonably accessible or reasonably accessible without much effort. You know, so lands that are too steep or inaccessible for other reasons are not considered in the technical forest biomass. You can see that below in that second section there. There's gross forest biomass resources is 26 million bone dry ton. Technical forest biomass resources is 14 million bone dry ton. So biomass utilization factor is referencing the technical forest biomass, and then we're adding a utilization factor to that. So we can, right now you're looking at it at 17.5. We could put it at 100% utilization of biomass, 10% utilization of that technical forest biomass, or whatever. So that's a really important little input cell that we use quite often in this, that you'll see in this presentation. The other one is the biomass conversion efficiency, just below that there, and is the third one down. That is the biomass conversion to biochar, and it's on a per weight basis. So if 1 ton of biochar, 1 ton of biomass, 10% conversion efficiency to biochar. So in that case, for 1 ton of biomass, 10% of the weight of that biomass would become biochar. You can change that conversion efficiency as needed. I put it at 10% because it's incredibly achievable. And I think 20% is more the case in some situations, but looking at a broad spectrum and just, anyway, so I just I have it set at 17.5 and 10%, and you'll see why later. I just wanted to highlight that those numbers are incredibly useful, and if you change those, everything on the output side will adjust accordingly. So next slide. Here's the output values. And again, we have the biomass utilization factor and the biomass conversion to biochar efficiency stated again there, but when you go play with this, use the input cells to change it, because these have formulas in them. All right, and then here's our output values. So when we are utilizing 17.5% of the technical forest biomass, and we are achieving a 10% conversion efficiency, our biochar production is 250,000 tons. So there's a whole bunch of outputs here. So again, the first thing we're looking at is there enough land in California, agricultural land, to accept this much biochar? So we have biochar application on agricultural land. The first one there is just at 2 bone dry tons, just kind of a number there. That's what a lot of farmers have been using in California is kind of an economical application. It would take 202 years at that application rate. Something that's a little more ecologically beneficial, but sometimes economically costly, is about 9 tons per acre, 9 bone-dry tons per acre, which is equivalent to 1% soil organic matter in the top 6 inches. At that higher application rate, it would still take 914 years until we covered all of California's agricultural land. And if you want to, again, look at what is being considered agricultural land, that's all referenced. There's a lot of differences in how you count that. So the basic answer was yes. Yes, there is more than enough land in California to accept the biochar, even if we were to produce biochar from incredibly significant portions of the available biomass. So for instance, if it's not shown on this slide, but if you set the biomass utilization factor to 100%, it would still take 160 years till we covered all of California's agricultural land with that application rate. And we could also apply more with additional benefit. So that answered the first question, can we do this? I mean, is this possible? Is this feasible? Is this reasonable? And then, of course, it became more exciting. Well, what would be some of the outcomes? What would be some of the other outcomes of this? Primarily, in my interest, is the existential crisis we all face right now, which is climate change. I guess a better way to describe it, climate crisis. How do we get a grip on this so that we have a chance at a reasonable future for ourselves and our children? And so carbon management is, of course, incredibly important and one of the key metrics to doing that. So we looked at the carbon drawdown involved with this. We broke that down into 2 sections. We'll describe that more. So why don't we go on to the next slide? So carbon drawdown is, of course, that's really what's driving me personally to be doing all this, is a way to help balance our atmosphere and leave a legacy of fertile soil. That's my draw to biochar in a nutshell. So in showing the carbon drawdown, there's a lot of difficulty because what is carbon drawdown? Carbon drawdown is a word that we're using now because greenhouse gas emission reductions, or there's just so many different ways to discuss this. And I almost think, I was just thinking this morning, but it was too late to change the slide. It's like, I should really change this slide and say carbon drawdown and hold down, because we need to not only draw it down, but we need to hold it down. That's another way of describing why I broke this down into 2 categories. So in this model, I broke it down into 2 categories, which I think is an important way to look at it. And it helps, at least in the modeling, creation of the modeling, it sure made things a lot more clear. So we broke it down into carbon sequestration. That's the embodied carbon in the biochar. You take a wood chip, like you can see down here in these pictures, you take a wood chip which is completely naked and exposed to biodegradation, biodegradation, which can happen in a fairly short time span. And then through a thermochemical process we call pyrolysis, we make that into biochar, and the carbon changes form into a more recalcitrant state. And that carbon is not very biodegradable and will be resistant to being mineralization and being broken down and released to the atmosphere for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we're changing the time frame in which that carbon is going to re-enter the atmosphere. Once we lock that carbon into biochar, as long as we don't burn it, it's pretty much locked down. That's the carbon sequestration, that's the embodied carbon. Secondly, that biochar is very useful material, and the utilization of that can result in greenhouse gas emission reduction that does not negate its sequestration value. So if we take that black carbon that you see there in the second picture and we put it in a compost pile like you see in the third picture, we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from that compost, such as methane and nitrous oxide. We are working on getting better metrics on that, but it has been shown repeatedly And we've been easily showing ammonia. That's an easy one because ammonia meters are cheap and easy to come by. But reducing greenhouse gas by utilizing biochar and compost is kind of a win-win. You add a little bit of biochar to the compost, you reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. It makes the biochar better, it makes the compost better. It just works. And then that material is applied to soil, like you see in the fourth picture. And the greenhouse gas emission reduction continues because, as has been shown in many research articles, soil where biochar has been applied can show reduced emissions of nitrous oxide. And this week, in fact, we're delivering a few truckloads of biochar to a UC Davis, UC Berkeley research project where they are going to be measuring this with quite a lot of talent and money involved. So that's why we broke down into two categories. And then in that second category, greenhouse gas emission reduction, there is just a huge spectrum of areas that we could go into with the greenhouse gas emission reduction of use of biochar. But we just chose 4. There's 3 primaries: composting, manure management, enteric fermentation, where cows would, using it in digestion to reduce cow burps. And then all of those result in soil, so soil is kind of a catch-all. Next slide. Now here's what that looks like. Again, here we have the 17.5% and the 10%. That is going down to, you see your animal biochar application on land, you see how many acres of land, and then right here, we have how much carbon we actually applied, just direct carbon, and then we have the carbon sequestration potential. So, so that's showing the direct carbon sequestration. Let's go ahead to the next slide. And then here it gets a little more complicated because in addition to the direct carbon sequestration, we have this next section here down below, which is the greenhouse gas emission reduction. We built this in the model as a tiered system. So right now you see 0, you see 0 tons in the enteric fermentation. We thought that composting is the first. It's easy to get into. Manure management, a little tricky. There is a little bit of permitting, a little bit of stuff we've got to accomplish before we get into that. And enteric fermentation, well, it's going to be a couple years before we get there. So we built that in a tiered system that until composting is filled up, it's an if-then calculation. When composting is filled up, then it moves to manure management, then it moves to enteric fermentation. This whole section, you guys, we spent a good amount of time on this, but it could really use a lot more time. So if anyone wants to help us out in making this more robust, we'd greatly appreciate it. I'll talk more about that later if I have time. So then here you see the combined impact of ancillary benefits, the greenhouse gas emission reduction benefits, plus the direct carbon sequestration. We're up to 1.4 million tons, about 1.5 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent. And I guess now is an okay time to mention why I set it to 17.5% and 10%. 17.5% biomass utilization factor and 10% conversion efficiency is completely achievable. Right now, we are producing biochar in California with a modified biomass power plant. We have identified a series of other biomass power plants that have the correct technology, are in appropriate regions, and have reasonable, and have the right kind of management, that they could be easily modified with a relatively low capital expenditure and a relatively low time till it's finished. Basically, we're looking at millions of dollars and a couple years. We could get up to this amount with, I don't know, something like $20 million in 2 years of time. This is how much biochar we could be producing. Now, this would take a whole bunch of effort. We'd have to have a huge collaboration, but this is entirely possible without even building a brand new machine, just by modifying existing old machines. I'll talk about that more later if we have a chance. But that's why, and I hope that gives some relevance and some oomph to this conversation. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm realizing now I'm taking my time on this and I'm running out of time. So I'm gonna have to blast through some of this pretty quick here in order to get towards the end. And there will be chance for questions later. So excuse me, but I'm gonna have to go kind of fast here. So taking it beyond just the you know, in this same section here, we have direct carbon sequestration, then we have greenhouse gas emission reduction. Then beyond that, we wanted to show the cost per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent drawdown. Now, we did this in a fairly simple way. Or I guess one of the ways is we simplified the calculations on this, not by looking at everything involved with the machinery, but let me just explain something about how Pacific Biochar works. We don't own the facilities that we're producing biochar with. There's 2 facilities in California. One of them likes to remain quiet. The other one is now in production and is very open to sharing everything that they're doing. What we do is we work with that facility. We partner with them to modify their machinery for biochar production. And the whole end game on this is that we're able to offer them a price on carbon and a promise to purchase everything they produce. And if we can offer them a price that is profitable, they will do it. And so that shows that at this price, it is both sustainable and profitable for them to produce biochar and to continue producing biochar and to expand their production of biochar. And we're paying a little bit more than this right now, but this is in the ballpark of what we're paying. And that's very transparent of me to say this to you guys, but we don't really, again, I feel urgent that we need to kind of solve this crisis and not be too protective of our businesses at this point. So we're paying a little bit more than this, but this is roughly a sustainable price. And if we were able to offer that price and promise that price on a large scale, we could get to that 17.5% that I was talking to you about. Anyways, so at that price, we're able to produce biochar. So biochar value equals, let me just get down to this equation here. Biochar value equals the biochar price per ton, shown above at 225, times the biochar tons produced, which is the biochar production. And then the drawdown cost is the biochar value divided by the tons. So how much is the cost of the biochar and how many tons did we sequester? So this 1%, this example 1, this is actually what we're doing right now. This is actually our production, this is our production amount that we're achieving right now at Loyalton Cogen in Loyalton, California. So here we go to how much biochar we're producing. You can see that here in the biochar production, about 2,800 bone-dry tons. The carbon sequestration potential is about 8,400 tons. And that's based on our own little, that's based on, anyways, you can look to the narrative to see how we calculated that. There's more to come on that as we're developing biochar accounting protocol. That will be further developed, but for now we have our own, and that's shown in the narrative. So that's the direct carbon sequestration, 8,000. And then if we look at the ancillary benefits, we're looking at about 3,000, looking at all of that going into composting and then soil, and then we achieve about a 3,000. The combined is about 11,000. So we're able to get direct carbon sequestration of about $76 per ton. And the combined is about $55 per ton. And again, this is just a model. This is not, there's no actual market that we have this. It's just a model to try and get a picture of what we're looking at, because I wanted to be able to have an idea of what are we talking about. Can we compete with, let's say, direct air capture? Direct air capture is getting a lot of attention these days. They're looking at something like a $600 per ton to sequester carbon. So this is just a frame of reference here, and in that frame of reference, we're looking pretty darn good compared to that. Okay, I've got about 10 minutes to wrap up here, so next slide, please. Example 2, this is a very near-term expansion that we're looking to do at Loyalton in the next year or two. And this would increase the efficiency of what's done at Loyalton and get us up to a better conversion efficiency, which would consume more biomass. Again, we're capped at about 16 megawatts power at that facility. So we can increase our biochar production by increasing the conversion efficiency, and we have a plan to do that in the near future. That would get us up to about 18,000 bone-dry tons biochar production. Our combined direct carbon sequestration, well, our direct carbon sequestration would be about 50,000 tons, and our ancillary would be about 20,000 with a combined of about 75,000 bone-dry tons. Again, we're looking at a cost of about 55 tons per ton of carbon, and $55 per ton of carbon. Next slide, please. Here's example 3. Here's the expansion up to a total of 8 plants, so 7 additional plants where they've all been modified up to a 10% conversion efficiency, and they're capped at their current megawatt output. We would be able to manage 17.5% of the technical forest biomass. We would be producing 250,000 bone-dry tons of biochar, and our combined drawdown would be about 1.5 million bone-dry, or 1.5 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, because we have also filled up that composting bucket, it goes into the manure management. Manure management has a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, so that really starts changing the cost of the ancillary benefits. Next slide, please. Here's example number 4. This is just just this kind of experimental. I don't really have an exact pathway of how we get to 55% biomass utilization. That would be utilizing all of the plants that we've identified plus a bunch extra, maybe some of the plants that Daniel Sanchez is working with, and maybe some of the other groups. I get a lot of interest from people that want to produce biochar in California and have plans to produce very large amounts of biochar. I see this a lot, and most of them do not actually succeed, but if they all did succeed, we would be producing a heck of a lot of biochar in California that might actually get up towards this amount. It's also convenient because that just fills these buckets that we created here for composting, manures management, and enteric fermentation as greenhouse gas emission reduction. And it's quite incredible to show how much that affects the cost of carbon drawdown. When we get into that bucket of enteric fermentation, where biochar is used to amend cattle feed, reducing methane involved with cow burps, it brings the carbon drawdown all the way down to $24 per ton carbon dioxide. And so I just want to stress how important this is. Right now, the protocol that is being developed is only looking at direct carbon sequestration. We do not yet have near-term plans for developing a protocol for greenhouse gas emission reduction, the services of biochar. We do not yet have plans to develop that protocol. It would be incredibly valuable to do that, as exemplified in this model. And that's one of the things that's fun to play with, and I highly suggest that you guys do play with this. You can change the input values and play with this a little bit to look at how much these ancillary benefits can add to the carbon drawdown cost benefit kind of thing there. So let's move on real quick. I'm going to try and wrap this up in a couple minutes here. Next slide, please. Again, as I've mentioned a couple of times here, protocol for carbon sequestration is being developed. Right now, we're working with Climate Action Reserve, working on a biochar accounting protocol. We hope to have that on the market in about 8 months. We will be expanding the calculations to include alternative fate of biomass. What would happen to biomass, and what would be in the emissions associated in the alternative fate or fates? The emissions associated with biochar production, and then the energy use and or generation associated with biochar production. Those will all be important factors in accounting in the biochar accounting protocol. We will be looking for funding, and we will be looking for expert input to help develop the most robust biochar accounting protocol possible. Please contact me if you can help with that. In the meantime, the calculation we use is basically the molar ratio times the carbon content times the DC 100. It's just very simple. Anyways, next slide. On the greenhouse gas emission reduction, as I've been saying, more research, please. We would love your help. We have some plans that I would like to talk with you about if you're interested offline or in email. Funding collaboration are being sought for that. Next slide, please. Drought resiliency and nitrogen conservation. Not everyone cares about carbon. It really doesn't matter to a whole subset of, well, particularly America. Biochar, luckily, can walk on its own 2 feet. It provides value to agriculture. It provides return on investment, whether you care about carbon or not. And that's valuable. And there's also the potential to provide ecosystem service benefits financially as well. Drought resiliency and nitrogen conservation are both outcomes of biochar that are very valuable. So we added that to the model as well. There's full discussion of that in the narrative, and again, you can look at the model to see how we did that. I'm just going to kind of briefly go over this. We included a bunch of stuff. Okay, so looking at the 17.5% and the 10%, we could increase the water holding capacity in soils by some huge number of gallons. How much is that? I don't even know, right? So we also showed that in acre feet, because acre feet is a little bit more relative. So if you covered an acre in water, it would be 2,294 feet, a column of water 2,000 feet high. That's how much water we would be saving. And the calculation that we used is 1% of organic matter in the top 6 inches of soil would hold approximately 27,000 gallons of water per acre. This is a commonly thrown around phrase. That's what we use to calculate this, rather than picking one individual or conglomerate of biochar specific studies. We just went ahead and housed biochar in the general form of organic matter, which is by default how it's recognized. Again, I'm running out of time. I could go on this subject for a long time. Look to the narrative to find a greater discussion about it. Sorry to be so brief. Next slide, please. I'm going to run through this super fast. This is brand new. We have not been able to share this information much until just recently, but it shows to kind of, again, I really think there's something here. We have an immediate need to deal with a really big problem in California, and we, I believe, have a very tangible and real world solution. We're already doing this. We can scale up very fast, and there's many, many benefits, not only with carbon drawdown, but we can not only draw all that carbon down, but we can leave a legacy of fertile soil, and we can do it in a way that has near-term benefit as well. So here's a very interesting study showing water conservation on a Salinas Valley vineyard. We applied biochar only, compost only, biochar plus compost, versus no amendments to control. And we found that the biochar only treatment actually got the greatest yield of any, and it was 45% over the control. And this is with the same amount of water throughout the entire vineyard. This is 8-acre field trial, 4 treatments and 4 replicates. Done with UC Riverside. You can find more information about that. We will be publishing this later. There will be a lot more to come on this. Next slide, please. Just briefly, here is the yield in a graph. They basically got about a 1 ton of extra grapes per acre using the same amount of water with the biochar only treatment. Next slide, please. Here's some really great stuff. They did infrared by overflight, and this new program with VineView, they're able to do some pretty cool stuff with that, where they use algorithms to basically select out vine per vine. And so I'm going to run through these graphs super fast here. I don't want to go over the exact numbers, but I want you to just get a mental picture of what the shape of these graphs is. The red, orange, yellow, and green. This is the total. This is all blocks combined. And then we're going to look at the different treatments individually. Next slide, please. Okay, so now you see a lot less yellow and green, mostly orange and red. This is a control. This is where no amendments were made. Next slide, please. Okay, we're seeing a lot more yellow and green. And I'm sorry, I think I forgot to mention what this means. This is basically a vegetation index. We're looking at how much vegetation, another way to talk about this is plant vigor. How much biomass, how much leaf area has been created here. So this is with the biochar only. We've dramatically increased the vigor. Next slide, please. Compost only increased the vigor beyond the biochar. Next slide, please. And the greatest vigor of all was the combination of compost plus biochar. We have consistently found compost and biochar together to be greater than the sum of the separate parts. It's just a win-win. The two go really well. I'm getting some messages from Kathleen. Don't worry, Kathleen. I will wrap this up very quickly here. What's interesting to note is that even though the compost plus biochar had the greatest vegetation index, the greatest plant vigor, it was not necessarily the greatest yield. So yield and vigor are two different things, and that's always pertinent to the farmer's mind. Anyways, all of this was with the same amount of water. Compost and biochar got greater amount of plant growth and yield with the same amount of water, and that's really important in what we're looking at here. And we're putting carbon in the ground. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, why that was mentioned is just because to show that this is very possible. This is not just purely a scheme to put carbon in the ground. This has so many other benefits. This has so much other values in water conservation, nitrogen management, crop yield, productivity, leaving a legacy of fertile soils. And this is very possible. We are doing this right now. So we're really excited about what we're doing here with Loyalton cogen facility. This is an old biomass power plant, several decades old. The generator is a 1955 turbine. This is a boiler, basically burning biochar and burning biomass and making steam. There is quite a bit of emissions controls on this facility. Important to note here that in California, not all biomass power plants are the same. Biomass power plants that were permitted in the 50s. I'm just saying if there was a biomass power plant permitted in the 50s, they get grandfathered in generally. And so whatever their allowance for emissions was in the 50s, they get grandfathered in on that. So there are some biomass power plants in California that have very dirty emissions. So when they say that biomass power plants are horribly dirty, sometimes that's really true. This place had to get re-permitted recently. It has, I guess you could call it state of the art, very, very advanced and quite robust emissions cleaning technologies on here. We did a light modification of this facility to produce biochar. So this is a big old plant, and with a little bit of tweak and a relatively low capital expenditure, we are able to produce significant quantities of biochar here. And I just like to voice how I think it's really interesting, and I think it's very pertinent to look at reduce, reuse, and recycle. And that's what we're doing here. Rather than building something brand new, I think there is a lot of value to reusing old things. We can reuse old things, reduce our carbon footprint involved with building new stuff, and recycle a bunch of old metal. And that's what you see in this picture down on the left. This is where biochar cat's been, and it is just like a mishmash of old recycled metal. I love this old plant. So we're looking at producing quite a bit more here, and we welcome anyone to come take a visit. Dan Sanchez was there about a month or two ago. Next slide, please. The biochar produced at that facility is either transported directly to the farm or brought to our compost yard, our processing facility, which is co-located at a compost yard. This compost yard began as our client and has now become a partner. We move a lot of biochar through this facility, and we use shared equipment, so it's very efficient. Next slide, please. I just want to note it is pretty exciting to look at all the potential, but if I get a lot of calls about companies that want me to be their offtake partner. They want to produce ridiculous amounts of biochar in California, and they have no idea what to do with it. And they call me and they say, hey, Pacific Biochar, we don't know what to do. We can't move all this biochar, or we don't know what to do with the biochar that we plan to make. Can you move it for us? I don't really get a lot of calls for people saying, I want to consume that same ridiculous amount of biochar. We are selling biochar quite a bit, and that's growing a lot. But generally, this is a demand. The greatest obstacle is demand, not supply. And so the greatest amount of help is in the demand side. And I just want to stress that because I think it's really important that we really focus a lot of our efforts on building demand, or else we're going to be imbalanced here. And there's a lot of ways we can do that. Then I ran out of time, so I won't be able to speak that much. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide, I believe. Oh, you stole it. Anyways, there was one slide. It was the same slide that I showed in the beginning. It's our biochar delivered on a vineyard, and it's very pertinent because that same vineyard that we delivered biochar is now just a bunch of sticks. There's a picture that shows a pile of biochar and a vineyard, and then a forest in the background, and all that forest is gone. Just last year, it was all burnt up in a big fire. And so I just wanted to express, like, this is very pertinent. This is happening right now. These forests are burning. We need management tools. We need to deal with this. This is a crisis, a climate crisis, and in California, a wildfire crisis. So I just want to express that this is a model, and it's very interesting to look at, but it has real world implications and a bit of urgency to it. So I just thought that was pertinent, and I wanted to reiterate that there. So thank you much for your time. Sorry for going so far over. We have some time left for questions and answers, and I believe Kathleen will assist you with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Josiah, and I'm sorry for inadvertently deleting that last slide. I thought it was a repeat. And then I definitely want to agree with you that the choke point right now in building the industry is on the demand side. I get very similar calls from people asking what they can do with all that black stuff that's piling up. So there's a big emphasis on that right now. And I also wanted to say to those listening in that Josiah and I have talked about having a future webinar in a couple of months on the vineyard topic, because I think there is a lot of interest and a lot of positive stories to come out of that. So we will try to schedule that sometime in the next several months. I also want to say that we had a lot of questions come in. There is no way we're going to get to all of them, but I want to make sure with Caroline that we could extend for maybe an additional 5 or 10 minutes. Is that all right?
Yeah, I can only do 5 extra minutes today, but we can have an extra 5 minutes.
Okay. Good. So I'm going to try to be efficient on the questions and keep to the ones that are really specific to this webinar. There were a lot of questions that were a little off topic. One of the big questions that we get a lot is if, Josiah, you could talk a little bit about what the ratio of biochar is to compost. And also there were a couple of questions about the conversion factor you use between carbon and CO2, which is generally 3.67, but I think yours was somewhat less.
Okay, I can answer those really quick. So biochar to compost, generally what I found is get the compost right to start with. You know, there's a lot of talk in composting about getting your carbon to nitrogen ratio balanced. Okay, biochar is carbon, but it's not that same kind of carbon they're talking about. It's not labeled carbon. So you want to get your compost somewhat balanced to begin with, and then use the biochar as an amendment to that on top of that. And we're looking at usually 5 to 10% by volume as quite effective. Even as low as 3 to 5% as being quite effective as well. So that's the kind of the range that we're working with. Now, even though I just told you get your carbon nitrogen balanced to begin with, in the case where that's not really possible and your nitrogen is just way too out there, biochar will help balance that out because it does work kind of as a nitrogen filter. So in the case where you have incredibly high nitrogen or otherwise sloppy, mucky compost, you can add more biochar than you normally add, say maybe 10 to 20% biochar by volume to help get a really good compost. And if you want to learn more about that, we developed a white paper. It's on our website, Pacific Biochar. Go to the resources section, look at compost plus biochar. We have a whole white paper we developed on that with research and our own expert input. For the carbon accounting, what we did is we just did the molar ratio, which is 3.67, right? But a ton of biochar is not pure carbon. So we have to look at the carbon content of the biochar. So molar ratio times the carbon content, 85%. So molar ratio times 0.85. And then not 100% of that will be, not 100% of that you can count in your carbon accounting, because you have to only account for what will still be here after 100 years. That's the current metric we're using. That's called BC 100. Jim Amonette helped us work out some BC 100 calculations based on the Biochar for Environmental Management, the big biochar book. So using that, and then with some calculations that Jim and Eminette helped us with, we developed a spreadsheet for calculating the BC100 based off of the HC-org, the hydrogen to carbon ratio, which is a measure of the aromaticity of the biochar. That is included as, I think, the third or fourth page in the worksheet. So you can check that out, and you can add your own HC-org and see what the output is. So that's how we got to that number. And I think in the model we have right now, it's about 2.94. So there's those answers.
Thank you. One thing I do want to say, Josiah, is that the European Biochar Consortium is creating some similar methodologies for this new carbon removal marketplace for biochar specifically. So it would be good to connect with those guys so that we're aligned. Daniel, I have a couple of questions for you. Doesn't the removal of large shade trees increase soil dehydration? So that was one. And then the other one is, are there any feasible wood products other than biochar that could be produced from slash piles?
Sure. So, towards the first question, undoubtedly, there are very important silvicultural considerations that need to be taken into account when we're considering forest management. In this case, the question was specifically about whether or not there is increased drying related to tree removal and soil drying. I'm not an expert in that, so I will just, for the sake of time, say that I probably won't be able to answer specifically about the water and the hydrological balance and the impact of management on that. The second question had to do with whether or not, what are some other innovative wood products that we're considering, and I think that particularly could be that could take advantage of forest residues or otherwise waste biomass, and we're thinking about a lot of them right now. I'm actually involved in a new initiative, a new institute funded by the state of California called the Joint Institute on Wood Products Innovation, and we're in the middle of a literature review to really try to identify all of these different emerging innovative wood products outside of kind of the world of structural wood products, which really requires kind of high value and very strong commercial saw logs. We're interested in a number of other different bioenergy products made through a number of different conversion processes. So this could be, rather than pyrolysis-based, this could be gasification-based, gasification with Fischer-Tropsch. There is gas fermentation as well to make ethanol. Manzotech is pioneering that technology, and we're seeing that start to be deployed in California. A lot of interest in coupling carbon capture and sequestration to bioenergy processes, thus providing a different way of removing CO2 from the atmosphere than biochar. And then there's also some work to turn essentially low-value wood into other kinds of dimensional type lumber. So people are talking about things like mass plywood. People are talking about oriented strand board, and these are really kind of mechanical, thermal pressure-based processes to improve the strength and durability of wood that otherwise isn't as strong and durable as we need it to be to serve most of our other applications. And so I recommend, there's some really great work going on at Oregon State University specifically on topics like that. In the state of California, the Beck Group, which is a consulting firm out of Oregon, has put together a number of different studies thinking about different products and utilization options, trying to think about which one would work best for the state of California. And I'll also just mention that the Joint Institute on Wood Products Innovation will be putting out its initial review sometime in the month of December, which will really hopefully try to localize this question for what are the most promising innovative wood products that the state should be focusing on.
Great. Daniel, one other quick question. Is there anyone like you that's focusing more on the ag side versus forestry related to biochar in California?
That's a good question. So there is one other person who we've probably a lot of other folks have probably come across by the name of Stephen Kafka. He's at UC Davis, and he has the same type position as me. So he is a cooperative extension specialist where he runs a research program, but then also does outreach and extension and works with technology developers and policymakers and resource managers. He has been running for several years something called the California Biomass Collaborative. That that if anyone searches on Google for California Biomass Collaborative, you should be able to find it. But his name is Stephen Kafka, Kafka, I believe. Great.
I'm noticing a lot of these questions are a little peripheral to the topic, but what I'd like to suggest is Carolyn can capture these questions and then maybe we could share them with our two speakers. And if they can't answer them, we'll go out and try to find some people that can. But in the meantime, I'll try to get to a couple of more that are more topic specific. One, I think this might be for both of you. If biomass combustion ash is used as biochar, how does the liming effect, the oxides or hydroxides, affect soil quality and fertility?
I'll answer that one.
Question for Josiah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll answer that one. So I work with biomass combustion. That's how we're producing biochar. And so one of the things that somebody who might be familiar with combustion and biochar production, they might have noticed that the conversion efficiency at 2%. If the conversion efficiency is at 2%, you would imagine that there would be an incredibly high amount of ash in the biochar produced. And that would be the case if all of the ash went into one pile. But what we're doing here is that we're actually separating the charcoal portions from the ash portions. And we're doing that before it ever comes in contact with water. So we're able to get quite a bit of separation there. And we end up with a biochar product that has about a 4 to 5% ash content. And most of that is a very large portion of that is just the ash that's kind of entrained in the carbon matrix. You can't ever get to 0% ash content. And so that's one thing that's really important. And so there's really two products from the facility at Loyalton at 2% conversion efficiency. They're producing quite a bit of ash. Before we started making biochar, everything was just going to ash. It was about a 1% conversion. There was a little bit of carbon in the ash. But their ash content, their ash was about a 30 to 40% carbon content, which is a significant amount of carbon over time, but that's mostly just ash. So we bumped that up a little bit, and we also added some pretty robust separation and harvesting equipment to get the carbon out of there separately, and that's how we're able to do that. Now the ash portions of that, yeah, at a high temperature. In a biomass boiler, your temperatures are pretty high. You may make great biochar, but you're also at temperatures high enough to make oxides. Add some water, and you've got hydroxides. You can get pHs in the high 11s. It's pretty amazing. I mean, it's powerful stuff. So that is to be considered. Now, in soils where the pH is low and they're acidic, that can be a wonderful liming agent, and that can have additional benefit. And the ash content can have a lot of mineral value, such as potassium, calcium, phosphorus, and other valuable minerals. So in some situations, that's a benefit. In other situations, such as alkaline soils, which are very common in California, the ash content the pH of the ash can be very limiting and actually exclude it from use. And in many soils that already have high mineral content, the extra minerals in the ash are not wanted, and in fact become, a complicating factor that might want to be avoided. So that is something we're considering, but that's a good to point out that not all black stuff that comes out the back of a boiler should be considered biochar, and the carbon content and the ash content need to be considered. Thank you much for that question.
Yeah, I'll second that. A quick question to what feedstock was used for the biochar that was used in the vineyard project, and did you vary the feedstocks?
All of the biochar that we're producing comes from softwood forestry. So it's all a mixture. Right now, the biochar we're producing is, it's virtually 100% forestry residue, and almost exclusively from designated high fire hazard areas. So areas that have been designated by California as high fire hazard risk. So we're dealing with forestry residue from high fire hazard areas, and that's a mixture of logging residues, sawmill residues, and also thinning operations where they go through and they manage the forest. So some of that is species that are not softwood, such as occasionally there's a little bits of madrone and some chaparral type stuff, but it's almost exclusively softwood, and that was what was used in the vineyard trial. And I think this also leads to another part where I think a lot of the questions might be revolving around is forest management and the role of going in there with big machines and cutting down trees, and how is that good? And I think part of that can be encapsulated in that question of that was asked earlier about leaving large canopy trees and the how important that is. So there's two feedstocks of great interest going to our production of biochar right now. One of them is the cleanup from the campfire, catastrophic wildfire in California, and a lot of materials from that cleanup process are being used, not like construction demolition, but the forest residue materials from that cleanup process are being used for our biochar production. And another one is this 7,000-acre blue forest conservation project. And I implore you to go check out that company, Blue Forest Conservation, where they're actually doing forest thinning to increase water capture and forest health. And so in some situations, the hydrology of a forest can be dramatically improved with a little bit of selective thinning. And so the forests are a really complicated and dynamic system, and that is an interesting organization to help answer that that question. Sorry, I talked too long there. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna just do one more, hopefully short answer. Question is, good looking model, why the methodological decision not to include OPEX here? It would seem extremely relevant to A, consider the total emissions of the operation, and B, the minimum viable cost.
Please check in with me offline. I am not adept at using OPEX, and I'm sure that could be very useful, and maybe you can help me integrate that into the model, and version 1.2 will be even better with your help.
Okay, I'll connect you too. Okay, well, I know I don't even think I got to half of the questions, so my apologies. But as I said, we'll attempt to get answers and post them somewhere on the IBI website at some stage. So I first want to thank the two speakers today, Daniel and Josiah, for all your willingness to share that information. I think it was really valuable, and hopefully it will inspire others to do similar things or to collaborate with you. Next slide, Carolyn. I just wanted to quickly highlight a couple of things that are coming up. I think we missed certain normal audience members because of the ongoing biochar conference and study tour down in Australia. But if any of you are down there and want to join for another day or two, that's happening. And then next month we will be, some of the IBI board will be going over to Korea to see what they're up to, and they're hosting the IBI Biochar World Congress, which I encourage any of you that can attend to come. And next slide. I just wanted to give a quick heads up that for those of you that are not IBI members yet and you signed up for this webinar, if you'd like to convert your payment for the webinar into a year-long IBI membership, you can do that for only $40, and you can do that by contacting our executive administrator, Brian Shore. With that said, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we will be creating another one of these webinars soon. Thank you very much.